All right. So what we're going to do tonight is actually, it's not a Teshubot of the Rambam proper. This is a letter of the Rambam, which we're very, very grateful to have, that was not necessarily available to many people over the years. And so, we found the Geniza, and in various Genizot, we found specifically, mainly the Cairo Geniza, we found letters of the Rambam. And so what I'd like to do with you tonight is I'd like to look at two letters. We're not going to read all of it, right? We're going to listen the whole letters all the way through. We're going to take some sections of it, and I'll put them up on the screen. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to look at some principles that HaRambam explicitly writes with regards to how it is that we are meant to treat law, adjudicating law, but specifically around leniency, right? So the reason why I want to use these letters is because he speaks directly about when and how we should treat law around leniencies, which, to hear HaRambam speak the way that he does, so directly, so emphatically, as is, as we say, kedarko b'kodesh, right? It is very sure and straightforward way. HaRambam, just speaks like that because he's very, very much that way and confident of his Torah. He says these things that I genuinely believe are almost lost. And it's a shame that we do not have them in full force today. And it's almost as though I do wish, right? But my wish is not relevant because it just is a fanciful nonsense. It's not capable of being done. But I wish that HaRambam had written these things in the Mishneh Torah itself, but that was not the aim of the work. So we're going to look at these things. We're going to look at these really for no other reason but to simply hear him say it. Because the point of this series is to be able to see approach, perspective, thought, philosophy around the relationship to Jewish law and how it is that we should deal with these things. So what that means is that I will tell you a bit of background with regards to the letter that we're reading, but I am not going to get into the nitty-gritty halachic details of it because they are not key here, right? You'll know enough around the letter to be able to know what's being dealt with and how they're speaking about these things. But I genuinely am reading this with you only to be able to see the Rambam say a few sentences in the middle of it, because that's how powerful they are and how important they are. So let's get on with this. These letters are around a question. There was a question that was sent to the Rambam. We believe, I'm taking this letter from Rabbi Yitzhak Shelat's Igrot, right? He has the Igrot, looks like this. There's two versions of it. There's a 2-volume and a 1-volume one. Yeah, it's usually white, looks like this. Yeah, Igrot HaRambam, put out by Ma'ale Adumim, the yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim. Rav Shelat is a Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim. I think it's my son Isaac here. I hope that's the Isaac Dweck that's here. My son Isaac, is it?
Yeah.
Hey, Isaac, good to see you. Miss you. So Isaac is a Talmid in Ma'ale Adumim, and he the Rosh Yeshiva is Rav Shelat. So Rav Shelat posits, he believes that the person that is writing this question to HaRambam was originally a Jew who lived in Egypt, right? Because HaRambam is now living in Egypt answering this. Yeah, he was originally a Jew living in Egypt who knew HaRambam, and he moved to Baghdad. And he asks this question of HaRambam from Baghdad. And in Baghdad, right, is a whole rabbinate. And the rabbinate is connected, at least historically, although it has gone through developments and changes, is connected to the great yeshivot of Bavel that were, around at the time of the Talmud and before and after. So he is considered, he has the title Resh Geluta, right, the head of the Galut, which is a title that was given to the Amoraim, to the great Hachamim who lived, in that time in Bavel, who lived adjacent with, with Eretz Israel and dealt together with them. There was the Nasi and the Resh Geluta in Bavel. But the Resh Geluta at this point already was very much a a ceremonial position. He was a Talmid Hacham. I mean, he was definitely a Talmid Hacham, no question about it. But he didn't see eye to eye with HaRambam, and HaRambam felt, as I've said many times before, that the Spanish Hachamim, that the Hachamim of Spain were among the greatest in the world, and that their approach was different, the way that they thought was different. So what happened was that HaRambam's quote-unquote friend, Talmid, what have you, right? He's not an official Talmid, but somebody who HaRambam knows, is asking HaRambam a question from Bavel. So he's not asking the Rish Geluta this question. He's reaching out to HaRambam in Egypt to ask him this question. What is the question? The question is, Morenu HaRambam, is it mutar, is it permitted for us to go in boats or to go in floating vessels in a river on Shabbat? And the reason why he's asking HaRambam, is it mutar for us to go into boats on the river on Shabbat, is because the rabbinate of Bavel said it's asur. You're not allowed to do this. And he knows that in Egypt, they would have people go on the Nile all the time on Shabbat. And in Spain, they went in the rivers on Shabbat. And so he's asking HaRambam this question, but in the midst of the question is asking essentially HaRambam to weigh in on this halachic question that it seems that the rabbinate of Bavel outlawed. Yes, everybody have the context over here? What's going on? That's the question. So everything, the whole dialogue revolves around this question. Is it mutar to go in a boat or in a floating raft or whatever it is in rivers on Shabbat? Now, just another element of this, which is important, is why would it be asur to go in these things on Shabbat? The only reason, theoretically, that it would seem that it could possibly be asur is because of a halakha that we call Tehum Shabbat. And what is the halakha of Tehum Shabbat? The halakha of Tehum Shabbat is that on Shabbat, there is a limit to how far a person can travel outside of their local place. So there is, meaning essentially outside of the city, this is the way the Hachamim defined it. There is a rabbinic prohibition and there is a Torah prohibition. The rabbinic prohibition obviously has a closer limit than the Torah prohibition because they want to hold people back from transgressing the Torah prohibition. The rabbinic prohibition is 2,000 amah outside of the city. The Torah prohibition is 12 mil, right, outside the city. So what we need to deal with is the question of to whom, really. Am I allowed to go on the river? If I'm on the river, is it permitted for me to stay and travel outside the Tehum? That's really at the core of the question. That's really the only reason that it would be problematic, right? There's nothing inherently wrong necessarily with going on a floating thing in the water on Shabbat. The answer that, or one of the elements that opens the permission for this is another concept within the laws of Tehum. And the concept within the laws of Tehum that is important to know here is that the Hachamim say, in Tehum, lemala ma'asarat tefahim. There is no Tehum if you are above asarat tefahim. So that means that if you are able to float in the air somehow, yeah, and there's details of this, right? But if you're able to float in the air somehow, if you're up here, Tehum doesn't apply. Only if you're down within 10 tefahim. Now, on dry land, it will depend how you get up there. Who floats in the middle of, the air? Nobody, right? So there's questions. If I have pillars that are a certain measure, and I step on those, and I hop from one to the other, is there a problem of tehum? But the more important thing is that's only on dry land. In water, floating on the water, there is no tehum, and therefore, why? Because we basically measure it from the surface of the water to the water's floor, to the ground floor of the river or whatever it is. And the likelihood is that, of course, there's that much. And if you're on a boat, certainly there's that much. And so we assume almost automatically that there's some safek, right? But essentially automatically that if you're in the water, in a river, there is no question that there is no Tehum Shabbat, and therefore the opening to travel as far as you want on water on Shabbat is permitted. The question in rivers is the question, not in oceans, because in oceans, nobody disagrees that the ocean depth, I mean, if you're measuring from the ocean floor to where you are, there's no question of Tehum. Rivers, because they're smaller, because there may be areas where there's very shallow waters, that's where the issues come up. That is the question that was asked to HaRambam by his friend from Egypt. That is the issue that is outlawed by the rabbis in Bavel, specifically the Resh Geluta. So HaRambam writes a letter back to this person answering his question, and he essentially says it's completely mutar. There's nothing wrong with traveling in rivers on Shabbat. So this, of course, is leaked to the Resh Geluta. And HaRambam, actually, it seems that HaRambam said, you could leak this letter to the Resh Geluta so that he can see that this is what I've ruled. This is how I've said it. The Resh Geluta receives this letter, writes HaRambam a letter back saying, forgive me for taking issue with you, but you're wrong. And this is why you're wrong. So what we're going to look, and so what happens, HaRambam receives this letter, and HaRambam writes back to the Resh Geluta, responding to his letter saying that HaRambam is wrong. And it's in that letter that all the treasures are, right? This is where HaRambam starts to talk about how we need to deal with the law and how careful we have to be about making something asur that otherwise should be mutar. Yeah, and he deals with those issues in here. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the initial response of HaRambam to the primary question, right? To what the law is, right? Asked by his friend. Okay, so bear with me. We're going to pull this up. There's going to be a few times where I have to share different screens because I've had to take scans of this Teshuvah in pieces, unfortunately. But you'll bear with me, right? So we'll start with the first one. Are there any questions up until this point? This should be straightforward. I hope I've explained it in a clear way. No? Okay. So here's the question. Hashela. Right? If you're in a boat that the goyim are running, in the big rivers, right? We're not talking about little creeks here. We're talking about big, proper rivers, like the Nile, like Pirat, like the Euphrates, like Hideka, like the Tigris. Is that mutar on Shabbat? And the question is, we've gotten onto it before Shabbat. We're just now traveling on this vessel on Shabbat that is now traveling in the rivers. Is it mutar to do that? So HaRambam says, look, en hefresh ben halicha bayamim. By the way, notice, right? This is just a side point. Why is yamim? Why is there a dagesh in the mem over here? What would it mean if there was no dagesh in the mem? It's a hugely important point of grammar. Yamim without the mem means days. Yamim with the mem means seas, oceans. And that makes all the difference. If you say yamim, you said the wrong word. You said days instead of oceans. That's why you say yamim, right? Ulmikveh hamayim kara yamim. So if you hear a Baal Koreh who says ulmikveh hamayim kara yamim, you have to stop them and correct them. Because the halakha is that the corrections of the Sefer Torah only need to be made when the meaning of the word changes because of the pronunciation. And here the meaning of the word changes by what? A dagesh, by just enunciating it properly. So this is yamim, right? These are oceans. Hamiluhim, the salted seas, right? The salted waters. There's no difference between the oceans and these kinds of rivers that you're talking about that are massive, like they have huge water, like a huge amount of water, right, in it. En bo isur klal, he says there is no prohibition at all. Isaac.
Is there a significance that we say that we got onto the boat before Shabbat? Why does it matter that they got onto the boat before Shabbat?
Yes, because they don't want people to get onto the boat on Shabbat, but there's really an Isur de Rabbanan, because they don't want people to start travel on Shabbat. They want people to be resting on Shabbat. So the Hachamim restrict that. But if you're already on the boat, then there's a question, can I get on before Shabbat knowing that I will be on the boat during Shabbat? That's okay. But Mideoraita is not an issue. So in bo isur kilal, there's no problem. Ve'en efresh ben alicha b'sfina al gabit savar shel korot. There's no difference whether you're on an actual boat or ship or if you're on a savar korot means actual beams that have been put together as a raft. Yeah. Umashi domelaim or anything like it. Hakol mutar. It's all permitted. Elaim ken lo ayu amayim amukim, unless the water was very shallow or it wasn't deep enough. So much so, they would have to be so shallow that you didn't have from the surface of the water to the floor, right, of the river, 10 tvahim, which is about 30 inches. Yeah. In that case, then it would be prohibited. Then you would look at going on that water that's so shallow in the same way you would look at walking on the actual dry land. And then the isur of Tehum Shabbat would kick in that situation. But when you have waters that are higher than 10 tvahim from the floor of the river, going on top of the water there, running in the rivers in that kind of depth is perfectly fine. Because there's no isur of tehum when you are above 10 tefahim in an area of a karmelit. Right? A karmelit is neither a reshut rabim or a reshut rechid, which is essentially what we're talking about. And it's because of this that it's always okay to go in the ocean, right? In a boat. You could be traveling in the ocean during Shabbat on a boat, right? In any case, because there's always going to be that depth. The question that the Talmud had and said, if the Yisur Tehum is L'Ma'asara Im Lav, Omnam Ze Yisur L'Mal Ma'asara B'Yabasha. They were only asking that question with regards to dry land, if you were above 10 Tefahim. How do we deal with that? But Ba'avir Hayam, but on the ocean or in a river where it is a Karmelit, for sure, it's not a normal Reshut Rabim. Avir Kol Karmelit Lo Yitaleh Bo Yisur Tehum L'Mal Ma'asar Kelal. As long as you're above 10 Tefahim, there's no issue. Okay, so this goes on a little bit, but this is the core answer. Everybody hear this? This is HaRambam's base answer, and this is what's sent. He goes into more details later. This is the issue that we need to see, right, in terms of our basis. Everybody's got this, yeah? Clear and straightforward. Okay. So now this leaks to the Resh Geluta. Yeah, Resh Geluta gets this. He says, oh my gosh, Maimonides is ruling on things that he shouldn't be ruling on, and he's made a mistake, right? He's made a mistake by saying that it's mutar. So now starts the the dialogue. Now there's one line, by the way. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. There's one line in this initial letter that even here HaRambam says something very important, right? What does he say before we get to the next letter? What does he say? He says, look, you may say that in Bavel, the minhag is not to ride on rivers, right? In the rivers on Shabbat, right? What about that? What if, okay, maybe it's not an isur, but there's a minhag of the makom. The community in Bavel, based on the rulings of their rabbanim, established the minhag not to go in the rivers on Shabbat. So that HaRambam deals with. And he writes as follows, which is also very important. Okay, you see? He says, the fact that you mentioned, he's saying this to the guy who's asking the question, that they say this is based on minhag, or some say that it's based on a minhag. HaRambam says, look, it's true. Minhag, you have to be very careful with. It's very important. Ubebe'ur amruza, the Hachamim said explicitly about minhagim, devarim shel heter v'harim nahagu b'hem isur, if you have something that is mutar, but the people acted on it as an isur, and that is the custom of the place is not to do it, you are not allowed to open it up or to allow it in front of them, right? So that's, people I'm sure have heard that klal, or at least people have been involved in learning. It's a fairly prominently thrown around principle. And HaRambam is saying that it's a very serious principle. And the reason why it's a serious principle is because once you start unraveling things that people have a psychological relationship to as being prohibited, there's a difficulty in being able to differentiate. Once you've been matir something, how do you open it up? Now how, why is that allowed to be opened up and not something else being opened up? And the layman, who's not necessarily educated, will have difficulty in terms of being able to differentiate it, to delineate it. But HaRambam makes a caveat, and he says, and he points out that this caveat is explicitly stated in the Yerushalmi, because this principle is brought both in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. But the caveat is made in the Yerushalmi. And the Rambam points out the following caveat, which is a key caveat. And that is, Aval tzarich litnai sheberu Talmud Yerushalmi. You must, of course, remember the condition on that principle of minhag being so important that you're not allowed to allow it in front of people if they've already considered it as being asur. That is, tzarich leda she'oto hadavar mutar. They need to know that that thing is really mutar. In other words, that when you have a situation in which, according to law, the thing is permitted, but they have been accustomed to treat it as prohibited, you do not touch it and you do not permit it in front of them, as long as the people know, or at least the rabbis know, but the people are supposed to be, the people in check know that this thing really is mutar. It's just we are accustomed to treating it as though it's asur. If it's really mutar and we know that it's mutar, but we're accustomed to treating it as though it's asur, that you don't touch, because that was a conscious decision. Everybody knows the law of the Torah. Everybody knows the Torah permits this. We decided not to do it. That is not problematic. And it's not problematic because it doesn't cause misunderstandings of Torah. Now you're going to see a theme here. This is a very important point, because what HaRambam is saying is we have to be extremely careful, not just in terms of practice, but in terms of perception, what people think about the Torah. And if people have the wrong ideas about what the Torah is matir and oser, what it permits and prohibits, that's going to destroy Torah and ultimately Klal Yisrael. So you cannot keep something that is prohibited, that people think, with the people something that people are considering prohibited, and maintain it that way when they believe that it's actually prohibited. You can only do such a thing when they know that it's permitted and their behavior is stringent. But if their behavior, they believe they're doing what the law requires of them, and that's why they're not doing it, that's not acceptable. And in such a case, says HaRambam, you must tell them. You're not allowed to leave them thinking that. You must tell them, right? So here, take a look at this. This is the rest of it. And forgive my highlights, they're from my book, so there's certain things that I put in. He goes, Aval im hayu anshe oto minhag. But if the people that are doing that minhag, hoshvim badavar mutar shu asur, if they actually think that the thing is mutar, that they are being stringent with, is actually asur from the law, and they keep practicing this isur as though it's an isur, the kol sheken, and all the more so, if the reason why they think is asur, this is very important, it's a subtlety, but very important. So again, HaRambam says if they think it's asur when it's really mutar, and if they think it's asur not just because someone told them it's asur, worse, if they think it's asur because they actually deduced that it should be asur by mistake. You follow? Right? In other words, HaRambam is saying it's not just enough that they think it's asur when it's really mutar is a problem. It's why they think it's asur. If they think it's asur because that's what they were taught or they just made an assumption, you're still not allowed to leave them in that assumption. But all the more so if they actually came to that conclusion on their own that it's asur, which shows that they were absolutely mistaken, yeah. En ra'ui lehaniham beota machshava b'shum panim. It is not fitting to let them continue thinking that way in any circumstances. You understand? You hear this? any circumstances. HaRambam says, bishum panim. You're not allowed to let them keep thinking that. Aval, rather, tzarich limhot beyadam. You have to what's the word limhot? Moheh. What's the word? You have to stop them, right? To be moheh means you have to push against them, literally. And you must tell them that this thing that they thought was asur is really mutar, according to Torah. V'nafal lahem b'isurot ta'ut, and that they're mistaken in thinking that this is an isur. Everybody hear that? Why? Lefi she'en ra'ui likboa hata'ut b'shum panim. Because you should never, ever firmly establish a mistake. You should never firmly establish and allow for a mistake to be held properly. Likboa is like likboa mezuzah, right? You shouldn't fasten a mistake into the lives of the Jewish people. And by the way, says HaRambam, there's no difference in this, and he's going to reiterate this later. Ben isur hamutar ve'atarat asur. A mistake is a mistake. It doesn't matter whether you're saying something that's mutar is asur or something that's asur is mutar. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's a mistake, it's a mistake, and you cannot allow mistakes to stay in Klal Yisrael that we know are mistakes. This is huge. Very, very, very important. Okay, so that's the first principle that I wanted to show you, that HaRambam says outright, that he's basically saying this, look, it's very nice if you want to say that it's a minhag, but they have to know that this is a minhag and that it's really mutar. But if they're saying that it's asur and it's actually an isur min adin, that you have to stop. So HaRambam is getting involved in the Baghdadian politics, right? Legal politics, but he's basically doing it in the name of Torah. He's saying, look, I don't care where they live or who's in charge. You're not allowed to keep this way. Okay. Any questions up until this point? Yeah, this is a problem, by the way, because I've experienced this. I literally had people say to me when I was giving, as a separate inyan, that there's a difference between saying, listen, we think people should refrain from doing this, and making a gezerah that people shouldn't do it, right? After the close of the Talmud, we don't have the authority to do that either. We don't have the authority, that's for another time, right? But not for the shiur. But we do not have the authority to establish a gezerah on the people and say, do not do X because you may come to do Y, right? Like the way that people talk about bicycles. I've heard many, many, many times that the reason a person shouldn't ride a bicycle on Shabbat, assuming that a person shouldn't ride a bicycle on Shabbat, is because it may break and you'll come to fix it. I'm sure you must have heard this somewhere, right? So that is absolutely invalid as far as halakha is concerned. Why? That's a gezerah. That is a perfect template for a gezerah. Gezerah is the hachamim saying, don't do X, which is perfectly permitted as far as Torah is concerned, because you may end up doing Y, which is prohibited, right? So an example of this, which is a gezerah, which the hachamim did establish, is riding a horse on Shabbat. You're not allowed to ride a horse on Shabbat. Why not allowed to ride a horse on Shabbat? Not because riding a horse is problematic. On Shabbat, Torah doesn't say anything about riding a horse on Shabbat. The hachamim say don't do it. The reason why the hachamim say don't do it is because it was easy and likely and usual that when a person was riding a horse and wanted the horse to go faster, they would reach for anything to hit the horse with. And oftentimes they break a branch off of a tree and hit the horse. And that breaking a branch off of a tree, we would push you off a cliff for doing if we got you in the right circumstances. Why? It's an Isur Torah. It's one of the 39 Melachot. It's Tolesh. You're not allowed to break a branch off of a tree that is rooted in the ground. So the Hachamim said, look, that's very serious. You're riding horses all the time. Don't ride horses on Shabbat because you may come to do this prohibition. You can't say that about riding a bike. Why? There were no bikes, first of all, in the Talmud. And once the Talmud closes, we are not allowed, we do not have the authority to make such gezerot anymore because for many reasons, which we're not going to get into tonight, but essentially because we don't have a unified judicial body that is able to do this properly, nor a unified people for whom we are making the adjudications. And so, therefore, we do not, the term in halakha is en gozrim gezerot medatim. We cannot make gezerot from our own understanding. That is not a direct application of a gezerah from the Talmud. And that's a different issue, right? What HaRambam is talking about over here is not even that. What HaRambam is talking about over here is, listen, there may be situations where the Hachamim establish a minhag, right? A behavior for their kahal. We advise you not to do X, which is permitted, but we advise you not to do this. Sometimes, if they want to put some teeth into it, and it was the good old days, what way did the Bet Din or the Hachamim have to enforce their requirements or their asking of the tzibur not to do something? Can't be a gezerah. So what tactic did they use? It was essentially a social tactic which had legal ramifications to it if it was in good old days and proper form. How did they do it? Anybody know? Anybody suggest?
Cherem.
Cherem, right? Which is excommunication. So if you had a cohesive community and you had a fear of being excommunicated from the community, that's how the Hachamim got around it. So they would say, don't do X because otherwise we will not talk to you anymore. And not talk to you meant not look at you, not sit near you, not bury you, like all the big major things, right? Which, by the way, in the Syrian community still runs. In the Syrian community, not only in New York, but very strongly in New York, they do not accept converts to Judaism in the community. And how do they enforce that? Cherem. And the cherem is still extremely potent because nobody who's grown up in the Syrian community wants to be excommunicated from the Syrian community. And so the intermarriage rate in the Syrian community is less than 1%. Which has all other kinds of ramifications, and I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm just speaking about it matter-of-factly. But that's how they enforce it. And the only way that they are able to enforce it is because of cherem, and the cherem is profoundly potent in that community because it's a very, very close-knit, strong community. And when you're raised as being a member of the community, being such a major part of your mindset, throwing someone out is like throwing a fish out of water. And so it still runs till today in that form. But I have gone off topic, and so I'm going to come back to topic, and we're going to now look at HaRambam's response to the response of the Resh Geluta having read his initial letter and writing back to HaRambam saying, I think you're wrong about saying that it's permitted to write on the rivers, right? So how does HaRambam deal with that? So let's have a look. Yes. Okay, here we go. Oh, I believe this is it. Yeah, okay. Do you see it? Teshubot as a Rosh Yeshiva, is it there? It's clear? I don't know if it's right. Yeah, it's not. Okay, oh, well, let me fix it for you. Why do you not see it being? Why don't I? Hang on a second. You should. Hold on. Okay. You don't see it, but I'm going to do it again. Hang on a second. Forgive the technical difficulties.
Oh, beautiful handwriting, Rabbi.
Where did you see my handwriting?
There was some on the side on the margins.
Why, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. You know, Rabbi Ibn Gabirol, not Ibn Gabirol, Ibn Tibon, Yehuda Ibn Tibon. He wrote a last will and testament to his son. And it's an amazing thing. You should read it if you can get your hands on it. I have it, but maybe one day you can do it. And he writes to him what he wants him to do. And he says, look, I spent a huge amount of money for your books. I want you to read your books. And then he said, I want you to spend time every day practicing your handwriting, because a hacham should have beautiful handwriting. A person has to be careful about that. So anyway, that's just, you brought that up, so I mentioned. Okay, so here we go. Can you see now? Istakalnu, you see that? Okay. הסתכל במה שזכרו הגאון הגדול רב שמואל הלוי, ראש הישיבה של הגולה. Right? So this is Rab Shmuel Halevi is the Rosh Yeshiva, he's the Rosh Geduta. And he's saying, look, I saw what you wrote to me. וזו השאלה שנאמר לו משמי שרמזתי להראותה אליו, right? That you had written to me over a response that I gave that they had mentioned should be shown to you. וראינו שאין ראוי לא להשיב על פרקי זה הדבר, and you wrote back to me, and I said, look, I should not write back to the Rish Geduta. You know, I have to make sure to write to show kavod. So he says, Omnam, ma shigdim min ha'itnatzlut. This is great. I put this in because this doesn't have to do specifically with mutar and asur. This has to do with the midot of HaRambam, right? That's why, you know, these letters are so precious. I cannot overemphasize how precious they are that we have them. Because in the letters, you see an aspect of the man that you do not see in the Chibur, right? In his official book. The book was a very professional thing that was written for generations. This is Moses Maimonides writing to the Rish Geduta Babel, and you see his personality come out. You can still tell that it's HaRambam very clearly, but his personality comes out. So look what he writes. Apparently, the Rish Geduta apologized to HaRambam for writing on, you know, kind of taking issue with his halachic stance. So that HaRambam deals with first. And he says, look, Omnam, mashikdim min ha'itnatzlut miyoto meshiv alenu. You know, the fact that you open, first thing I'll say is, you know, the fact that you opened apologizing that you're answering something that I wrote. V'harachato b'musar, and you went on and on about it. Ubshevach lanu, and you also praised me in your letter. Hashem yimeleo tovot al kol ze. May God bless you and give you reward for all of that. It's so nice, you know, that you've done that. And really, I hope there's more Hasidim and Ba'alei Musar like you, you know. Now, when HaRambam says this, he's not being facetious. The one thing that you need to know about HaRambam is that he was extremely careful about his truth. So there were things that he wrote that were true technically, sometimes, and he allowed himself to write those things, even though they conveyed other ideas, but he was very careful about it. So he says, look, I wish there were other people that were nice like you. Shin Sadi is Shomrehu Tsurenu, right? I'm not going to read that out every single time, but it's like the same thing that we would say to somebody of Nun Yud Nero Yair or Shlita or whatever it is. This is Shomrehu Tsurenu, that the rock should protect him, which is HaKadosh Baruch. He says, look, there's no question based on how you've written to me that you think I'm like other people. She'anachnu kerov bnei Adam. That I'm like the most people, that they have a really hard time when people contradict them. Or if they answer them back. He goes, thank goodness, God has already, you know, taken me out of that nonsense. I don't have that problem anymore. It's not a hang-up of mine when people, you know, criticize me or whatever it is. But I love how he says it. He says, Pitaranu Hashem mizeh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken us out of that, patar otanu. He's exempted us out of it, right? Which I think is a very important thing to see for two reasons. One, if you recall, we had the Teshubot of Rav Kafir some weeks ago, remember? And Rav Kafir said, you know, there was a point there that he made that, you know, either I'm doing it or God's doing it, but there's no two ways about it. And since we have free will, and he went through on and on saying, since we have free will, there's things that we do that don't bring God into it. But that clearly, as I pointed out then, does not mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't help us with everything, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs through us, and that we recognize that it's lo korhi be'otzim yadi asali etahayil hazeh. And HaRambam is saying that even the element of his own character that has come to a point in where he no longer is moved at all by people's criticisms or you know, contradictions to his words. How does he say it? Pitaranu Hashem mizeh. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has saved me from it. Which implies two things. One, that he recognized that HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped him and blessed him. And two, that he wasn't always like that. He says, Kvar pitaranu Hashem. Fine, thank goodness, by this time in my life, I don't deal with that anymore. It's a way we say, I'm too old for that. Borei Olam Yodea. Notice how he brings HaKadosh Baruch Hu into his language. Yeah. He says, Borei Olam Yodea, he goes, the creator of the world knows, Afilu heshiv alenu katan shebetalmidenu. Even if the lowest of my students, the most young, not the young in age, but the least developed and most inexperienced of my students would answer something back to me, or haver, or a friend of mine, a colleague, or mitkomem, or even a person who was against me, trying to get at me, hayinu smechim b'zeh. I would be happy with it. Im heshiv teshuvah amitit, if it was true. I don't care who it is that tells me I'm wrong. If they're right that I'm wrong, then I'm happy to hear that I'm wrong. I'll actually be happy to hear it. That they bring me to an awareness of something that was concealed from me that I didn't know. And if it be the matter that, okay, they're wrong, I was right, and I know that I'm right, and the fact that they're answering me, because you could say, well, I mean, if you say that, HaRambam, then you only don't have a problem with people answering you when they're right and you're wrong. But what if you're right and they're wrong and they're still answering you back? He says it doesn't matter. Even if they do make mistakes. I'm not going to hate him or even push him away, which unfortunately we see happen today. I mean, there are many people that are big Rambamniks that are so staunchly Rambam that don't behave in his manner. So you say something that is against what they think, or you say something that they don't recognize as being true, even if you persist in it, they kill you over saying it, right? So this HaRambam clearly says not the way to be, right? He says, Lo nisna'u tov, lo narhakeu. He goes, not only will I not like them, I'm not going to push them away. Halila v'chas. V'lo nitpos alav v'yoto meshiv alenu b'ma shelo yit'ameh. And I'm not going to start, nitpos means start grappling with him over the fact that he told me something that didn't necessarily prove to be true. Why? Why? Because what are we? What do we do? We're doing with our brains. And we know that something is true or not true based on our capacity to be able to think it through. And it happens that people think things through inappropriately. What you don't see by the Hachamim, you don't see throughout the whole Talmud that Hachamim will ask questions that are later found out to be inappropriate questions, or questions that are thrown out because they don't bring a truth that is sustainable to the table. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're interested in the endeavor. Okay, so a person missed something or whatever it is, that's fine. The only problem I'm saying as a side thing here is when a person really doesn't care about learning or asking or thinking, they only care about fighting. That's a different issue. Or they need to be right and it's an ego thing. That's a different story. But HaRambam is saying this in a way, right, where he's pointing out, not a big deal that you didn't have to go on and on about it. I don't mind. You think I'm like regular people. I'm not. וכן זה הגאון, אף על פי ששמו אצלנו גדול, ומעלתו נישאה, ומדרגתו בחוכמת התלמוד כמי שמתפרסם עליו, is yes, not just that, but you mention a Gaon, who I recognize, he must be very great and he, a lofty individual, and I'm sure that his wisdom, as far as the Talmud is concerned, is as what everybody says about him. V'hu b'lo safek zaken v'yoshev b'shiva, and he's also an elder, and he's sitting in the yeshiva. I'm also not going to hold him as a problem in how it is that he related to my teshuvah, or what it is that I wrote. Why? Because it's not because he was, unintelligent. I certainly won't say something like that because of his lack of intelligence or because he had a problem with memory. It goes, the reason I have an issue is not because he was having a problem with his IQ or his memory. I have a problem with him because he didn't read what I wrote. That's the problem. And he should have read what I wrote if he was going to argue with me properly. What he did was he looked very cursorily at what I wrote, only with the very beginnings of study. And because of that, he ended up responding to me in the way that he did. And he's speaking to him in third person. He's talking to him. Now, now he starts getting into nitty-gritty, which we're not going to get into. But HaRambam starts to go through bit by bit. And he says, you said I made the mistake on this and that and this and that. And HaRambam starts to pull these things apart with him and show where he was wrong, right? But that's not what I want to do with you tonight. We're going to go later into the Teshubot, but I just want to show you how that opening line, how HaRambam dealt with it. Okay. So what HaRambam does now is he says he's gone through the halachic issues with regards to this. But now he gets to other principles. And one of the things that he deals with, and I think this is so important because we still hear this today, he says, you said to me that you saw none of the Babylonian Geonim allow riding in the river on a boat or whatever on Shabbat. And, I have to take issue with that, says HaRambam. And he does it in a very, he uses irony, right? He's sarcastic. He uses sarcasm with it, and a very cutting sarcasm. So take a look at what he writes. If that's where you want to go, because people say that. What Rabbi so and so said, or rabbis, the rabbi, or none of the rabbis said anything about this. That's not a sufficient halakhic argument. But HaRambam addresses that, and he says this. He says, Yaduahum Fursam. He goes, first of all, you're talking about the rivers in Bavel, right? Of course, in Baghdad, there's the rivers in the middle of the city. He says, look, Yaduahu Fursam Shenahar Ashbilia, right? That's Seville. He says that the river in Seville, Beno ben Ayama Maluach Shmoni Mil, right? Between the actual river and it's emptying out into the ocean is about 80 mil. It's a large distance. And ships come in all the time, and they usually are carrying oil. And on these ships come from the river into the ocean and back, and they travel to Alexandria. Alexandria Tamid. V'Yisrael ba'im bahem. And Jews come on it all the time. Notice again, another thing to learn from here. And not just from here, but from the Mishneh Torah. HaRambam never uses the word Jew in his writings. He never says Yehudi she. Always it's Yisrael she. Why? Because HaRambam is writing a national law for a nation. And Yehudi is not the name of a nation. It's the name of a tribe within the nation. And the Torah spoke to all of Yisrael, not the Yehudim. So HaRambam never ever uses that term. Notice, it's not used. So he says, look, Yisrael ba'im b'hem. And there's Jews on these boats, right? In English, I'm going to say, because if I say Israelis, you'll think something else, right? So Yisrael ba'im b'hem. Hachamim v'talmidim. Hachamim are on these boats. Their students are on these boats. Lefi kol ha'geonim sheyesh sham. And all the geonim in Spain are on these boats, or were on these boats. He goes, he goes, I remember when I was a kid, they were always on the boats. These Hachamim, Rabbeinu Hanoch, Rabbeinu Moshe Beno, Rabbeinu Yitzhak ben Giat, Rabbeinu Yitzhak ben Baruch, Rabbeinu Yitzhak Ba'al Halachot, Rabbeinu Yosef Halevi Talmidozal. He's going through like all the great Hachamim of Sfarad. And he says, Ume'olam lo nishma mehem b'zeh isur. You're telling me that nobody said it was mutar? I'm telling you all of my Hachamim never said it was asur. V'chen kol anshe Mitzrayim, not to mention all of Egypt. V'zeh no etzlenu re'aya. And although I will say, that's not a proof. The fact that the Hachamim never said anything is not a proof. However, the only reason I'm mentioning it, says the Rambam, is Amanu zeh lezeh hagaon b'shvil omro sheyesh etzlam geonim asru zeh. He said to me that the geonim made it asur. V'hoda'anuhu sheyesh geonim. And all I wanted to do was show that there are other geonim. You're not the only people that have rabbis. Unless, of course, elu ha'geonim shelanu b'shvil she'en arusotam bavel is a problem, right? Which HaRambam, that's the sarcasm. Where HaRambam says, I mean, I showed that our Hachamim also, we have also Hachamim, unless, of course, because they're not Babylonian Hachamim, they don't rate. Maybe the place, does something to the people. So what is he saying? Basically the same thing as saying, well, no, I mean, if you didn't go to this yeshiva, or if you didn't come from this tzibur, or if you're not from these things, they don't rate. Like what? We don't have hachamim. I know that you don't look at the Spanish hachamim the same way, but look, the Sephardi hachamim may not be the Babylonian hachamim, the same thing, but why should they be treated any less valuable or important? None of them ever said anything. The reason why I'm bringing all of these things out is because they are 100% contemporary. These arguments are the same arguments. It's just not Babel in Spain. But it is Sephardi and the alternative. And that's very important. So HaRambam is saying, look, I don't know, like as if we haven't studied. Maybe there's a different approach to things, unless a place makes somebody, more authoritative or not. Yeah. So he continues, and this is a hugely important part. And this is towards the end, and with this we will end. Then HaRambam, I didn't put it up. I'll just show you the end of that line, right? So he says, unless you say that you shouldn't listen to the Spanish hachamim because of the place that they live. This line, by the way, hamakom gorem, is straight out of the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that says the Bet Din Gadol does not have, the Sanhedrin does not have full authority if they're not in the Lishkat Gazit, if they're not in the hewn chamber on Har HaBayit. Why? Because hamakom gorem, because the place gives them that level of authority and power. So HaRambam was saying, I don't know, do you think you're like the Sanhedrin or something? Because the place is not the place that you think it should be? That Babel is where the authority happens and not outside of Babel? And this was a major dig, because what HaRambam was doing was saying, just because you're the Resh Geluta, you no longer hold that kind of authority that the Resh Geluta had once upon a time back in the time of the Talmud. So, yeah, so very, very powerful words. So HaRambam then continues. And he says this. So he goes through all of the issues, and he says, I really don't find anything that is prohibited. And maybe you're just saying that, whatever it is that you have, is there a question of whether it's the Rabbanan or not the Rabbanan? He says, look, if there is any prohibition whatsoever, which is what he mentioned in the beginning with the shallow waters, or even a safek of shallow waters, at best it's Isur de Rabbanan. And when there's a safek in Isur de Rabbanan, safek de Rabbanan lekula. So he says more than that. He says over here, he goes, I also want to tell you something in general. Forget about the river per se. There's other issues that are at hand here. Because even if you want to say to me, you know what, we should be mahmir, I'm going to tell you why you should not be mahmir here. And there are several reasons. One is, we know what the Torah says about having mercy and care over people's money. For example, when there's a fire, there are certain things that the Hachamim allow a person to do when they normally would not allow them to do it on Shabbat. So we allow them to do what's called gram kibui. We allow them to put out a fire in roundabout ways. Why do we allow them to do that? The Hachamim say because a person's money may burn with the house. And if you don't let them do this, which is mutar from Ikar Adin, they'll end up doing things that are Nisur Torah just to save their money. People are very, very protective. It's a primal urge to protect their money. So Hachamim recognized that, and they had to protect people that way. It's a normal human instinct that you don't want to watch your money burn in front of you, and that you're not going to be able to hold yourself. If you're watching your money literally burn in front of you, you're going to go and make an Isur Torah to save it. So the Hachamim tried to stop that from happening and allowed other things that they normally would restrict in those situations. Why does it have to do with running in the rivers? He says, he says, he goes, if you don't let people go in the rivers, there's a reason why people travel in the rivers. It's more efficient and it's safer. If you don't let people do that, you know what they're going to do? They're going to go on land. And it's expensive. And if you start making people pay out through the nose in order to be able to keep halachot, you're going to lose them. Not only that, there are times they're going to walk in the deserts, they're going to come into literal mortal danger. And therefore, because there's going to be damage to their finances, you need to be lenient with them in all aspects, in all situations. And make sure you take the most lenient opinion. The kula shebaderot means the most lenient of all opinions. So that we shouldn't cause damage to the money of Israel, to their finances. Of course, everybody keeps that today, right? Nobody's ever touching, the finances of the Jewish people. We don't want them to pay a penny more than what it is that they need to pay. Right? Yeah. So HaRambam says you have to be very careful to do that, not to put into danger their financial stability or their physical safety. And if you don't let them run in the rivers, you're going to cause that. So you can't be a tzaddik in these situations and be mahmir. Okay? And he says, "V'tzarich leda kol mi sherotze lismoch al hora'ah benuya al tila she'im hayu halicha beyabasha v'halicha b'narot hagedolot shavot b'inyan bitachon haderech." And if it were the case that they were equally safe, that you could go in the rivers and you can go on land and they were equally safe, well, all right, but it's not, because you get robbed and it's in the middle of places that are very vulnerable and dangerous. Then it's appropriate that people should run in the rivers and not on dry land, even on normal circumstances. Forget about Shabbat. It's dangerous otherwise. And then he goes through this whole thing, which I'm not going to read because of time. He goes through a whole thing saying, not only that, if you let people walk on land instead of the rivers, they're going to be prone to a whole bunch of Yisurim on Shabbat that are much worse than they would ever be exposed to by running in the rivers. So he goes through all of that over here. Yeah. And then he continues. And he says, based on all of this, listen. Like I said before, it is unfitting to keep a person doing an isur, meaning practicing prohibition, thinking that it was prohibited when it really isn't. Forget about the Yerushalmi that I mentioned before. He goes, not only that, there was talking about where people knew that it was mutar and they behaved isur. And the Yerushalmi says, if there's a mistake, then there's a mistake. But this is word. He said, not only that, it doesn't matter what it is that's the mistake. Like we said before, if it's mutar and you're making it asur, or it's asur and you're making it mutar, it is exactly the same. And this is something that's very hard for people to get into their heads. They think, listen, if something is mutar, but you tell them it's asur, no harm, no foul. At least, they're not doing anything. They're not actively engaging in anything. You tell them, look, relax, don't do it. And what HaRambam is saying is that is just as problematic as telling somebody when something is asur that it's mutar. Nobody would ever think to do that, right? Nobody ever say, oh my gosh, you're telling him it's mutar when it's asur, that's haram. Not allowed to do that. HaRambam is saying it's exactly the same thing the other way around. How do I know that it's exactly the same thing the other way around? Well, it's an aberration either way, but I'll prove to you that's the case from Zakin Mamreh. The halakha is that if the Sanhedrin established the halakha, they ruled on a law, and they said, this is the law. And a hacham of his own volition taught publicly against what the Sanhedrin ruled and told people to do things based on his ruling against the Sanhedrin, what's his penalty? Capital punishment. It's punishable by death for a Hacham to do that, for a Zaken to do that. Zaken meaning a Hacham. Does it make a difference whether he said that what the Sanhedrin said was mutar is now asur, or what the Sanhedrin said is asur is now mutar? Makes no difference whatsoever. The only thing that makes a difference is that he ruled against the Bet Din. The Bet Din said it was mutar, you said it's asur. Yeah, I said it's asur. What's the big deal? Bet Din. You ruled against the Bet Din. You're going to die. I mean, obviously, if we get you appropriately. And so on. The fact that it's a death penalty just shows how severe and serious it is. So HaRambam is proving it doesn't make a difference. Down to this line. וכבר ביארנו שהראוי להתיר לכל בני אדם כל מה שאפשר להתירו. And I already explained that it is appropriate to permit, this is different than what he said before. Before he was saying if people think it's an isur, you can't let them think it's an isur. He's saying more than that. He's saying if there is room to be matir for someone, לכל בני אדם כל מה שאפשר להתירו, then you must do so to all people, anything that you possibly can be matir. This is a klal. Why? Lo natriyah alehem. We cannot be overbearing on them. That's why Hacham Ovadia said to me, when I got my semicha, he said, the Torah says, v'chai bahem, v'lo she'amut bahem. And therefore, you have to do everything that you can to try and be matir. And Hacham Ovadia overwhelmingly was posek that way. He had a tremendous kohadei Torah. But why? Because we're not supposed to restrict people's lives. That's why. Torah is not there in order to be able to restrict people's lives in situations where it's not necessary. And there are others who believe that, to the contrary, restrict as much as possible. Keep people safe. What HaRambam is saying, you can't get more clear than HaRambam. That's what I'm saying. ראוי להתיר לכל בני אדם כל מה שאפשר להתירו ולא נטריח עליהם. ויש לאדם האחד בינו לבין עצמו. Now, a person wants to privately be mahmir. כל מה שירצה, he could do what he wants in his private life, as long as he knows what he's doing. That's why if you remember another shiur, right? Hacham matlub and the dishwasher. I pointed out to you, Hacham matlub said, if a person wants to be mahmir and use the dishwasher for meat and milk separately, mutar le'ahmir. That's why he said mutar le'ahmir. Because he had to say that in this case, it's allowed to be mahmir. You hear this? Then he goes on and he says, you said you didn't want to be nitpicky on my words. HaRambam says, please, be nitpicky. It's okay. Go pick my words apart. I really would appreciate you do that rather than looking at it on a surface level. And he goes on and on to talk about that. But we'll stop there. Yeah, so these are very important principles. And these are principles that are coming from none other than HaRambam himself. But they're in a letter. They're not in the Mishneh Torah. But they're nonetheless his handwriting. It's pretty powerful when you actually hold a piece of paper with HaRambam's handwriting, by the way. I haven't told this in a long time. When I first came, I think it was a year or two after I came, I was invited. Where's the Geniza? In Cambridge. Yeah. So I was invited to speak in Cambridge, and they knew that I'm a fan of the Rambam. So they got like really special things out of the Geniza to show me, which was very honored, that they brought me around. So, I'm walking around, they have all this stuff out, and they have a bill of sale from Maran, right? Whatever he sold, he signed the bill of sale, Rabbi Yosef Karo. It didn't say Rabbi, but whatever. And they're showing me all different wonderful things, from the Geniza. And then, he gives me a paper, or whatever it is, some kind of paper, in a plastic sleeve. Nothing more. And I'm holding it, and I look down, and I clearly can see that it's HaRambam's handwriting, because when you see HaRambam's handwriting, if you know HaRambam's handwriting, you know his handwriting. And I said, well, what is this? And I'm thinking he's going to tell me this was like a letter to someone, or, this was like, also maybe some kind of financial thing. He goes, that's a page from the Moreh Nebuchim. And even now when I tell it to you, I get choked up. I start crying. you realize you're holding the actual page that HaRambam held and wrote, and whatever page it is from the Moreh that changed my life. He wrote it to me 900 years later, and it changed my life. This man, because he cared enough to put this out, it impacted me to degrees that very few things did, and to be able to hold that and see it. So what I'm saying is, why am I telling you that? Not just for nostalgia, not just for the personal point. Imagine what you're reading here with me, HaRambam's handwriting. We have the actual handwritten document that HaRambam wrote. It was in Arabic. This is a translation, but it's a pretty clear translation. HaRambam himself is telling us these are the principles of Halakha. And this is the way of Torah. And perhaps one of the most powerful is, it makes no difference whether you say what is mutar is asur or as asur is mutar. If it's an aberration of the Torah, it's an aberration of the Torah, and that must be recognized. And that's why on Kippur, I don't know if you guys remember, we have a vidui on Kippur, the Sephardim certainly. Yeah. I believe the Ashkenazim have some version of it, but the Sephardim have a vidui on Kippur where we say, Asher asarta hitarti. Asher hitarta asarti. What you said was asur, I said it was mutar. What you said was mutar, I said it was asur. Asher timeta tiharti. What you said was tameh, I said it was tahor. On and on, go through all the things, but that's true. So it's something for us to be able, that's why I want to say in closing how important this platform is. People think that this is just like a nice cultural renaissance. This is not just a nice cultural renaissance. This is an approach to Torah that reaches the heart of what we believe is the truth and value and meaning of Torah, which is the heart of our people. And it's something that is not to be taken lightly. It's something that we cannot be bullied into. And that's another reason why I read this Teshubot. I'm closing the series, my personal Teshubot series, on this one, because HaRambam was bullied. Of course, he didn't respond to the bullying. He didn't let the bully, he bullied him back. But the Resh Geruta was trying to pressure HaRambam into changing. And HaRambam, that's why he wrote those cutting things. Why he was sarcastic. He wasn't just being sarcastic for the sake of being sarcastic. He was defending against the self-consciousness that he saw would ensue as a result of those tactics of whatever you call it, elitism, superiority, so on and so forth, control. And it is also one of the reasons why he wanted to fight so strongly for the Hachamim that he knew, the ones that he spoke of. So there you have it. It's an important, very important letter and an important principle that properly runs through our Hachamim, and you will have seen. That's why we learned many. We went from HaRambam in terms of time all the way down to Rabbi Chaim David HaLevi and Rav Kafer and Chacham Ovadia. There is a line. There is a genetic, or you maybe want to call it a mimetic, right? A mimetic tradition that runs across our derech. And what we're trying to do here in its nascent stages now is ultimately to be able to build a robust home for this derech to be able to be not only taught, but lived and understood and put out in the world. So I really thank you all for taking the time, and I thank all of your dedication. I specifically thank, Sina and Avi for their work, tremendous amount of time that they take and the focus that they have on being able to facilitate this and bring it together. Though they're not here, I thank all of the teachers that have been contributing up until now for this endeavor, because this is a serious endeavor. It's not just a nice project. It is a serious, important endeavor. And we need to support it with everything that we have. We have to support it with our time. We have to support it with our mind. We have to support it with our finances, as HaRambam said. We have to support it with our words, with our encouragement. It requires support because it's fledgling, and because it's been dormant, and because it's been bullied, and because we are self-conscious. And so that has to be pulled out of the tar. There's a beautiful line in Tehillim. It's mentioned twice in Tehillim, where David HaMelech, he says that Kadosh Baruch Hu, Vaya'aleni mitit mibor sha'on, mitit hayaven. Kadosh Baruch Hu pulled me out of the tar pits. Yeah. So that's what we need to do, and we will. And on that note, I hand it over to Avi Darson.
Wow, so powerful, Rabbi. And then I think these principles that we've just gone through throughout the series is so contemporary and relatable and relevant and to all of us. And I think it's a great foundation that we can build on. And I mean, what you just spoke about the Chabura is brilliant. There's not much I can add, but there is one thing I can say, which is I want to thank you for this amazing series. But you know, the Chabura is great, and I think we're going places, but it wouldn't be possible without your input, your guidance, and your advice in all matters. And you know, that's so important to all of us. And I think I can speak for everyone that, you know, we're already looking forward to the next series and building on this. And you know, please God, we'll go from strength to strength, and we'll be in touch, Sina and I, with regards to our future projects, the next curriculum, and we'll take it from there. And just remember, everyone, that it's all uploaded on our YouTube channel, so you can do Chazara, and I think it's well worth listening to them again. And yes, please go have a lovely week. I don't know if Rav wants to take one. I think there's one question maybe, or if not, we've run out of time. If not, I think
it's worth reminding everyone just that next week we've got Professor Zvi Zohar. Very, very honored to have Professor Zvi Zohar back. He'll be giving a class on Hacham Yisrael Moshe Chazan, the former chief rabbi of Rome and Egypt. So please make sure you come to that, because we're very honored to have Professor Zvi Zohar. So yeah, that'll be next week.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Good night,
Okay.
everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.